Good afternoon. At least it's afternoon for me. You may be seeing this in the morning. Anyway, my name is Brent Anderson, and I want to thank you all for inviting me to come to your classroom. I wish I could be there in person, but current circumstances are that we're doing it this way. So I want to thank you very much for this invitation and this opportunity to come into your classroom. And also I'd like to thank your teacher for sending me your letters, and to thank your Principal Zucconi, for delivering them to me. So I understand that you are currently reading this book by Andrew Clements called Lunch Money. And your teacher kindly gave me a copy of this to read, and I love this book. It is so wonderful, this book, because it, in many ways, it is like how I got started as a comic book artist, producing my own fanzines, my own comics, and going to school and all that. This book really covers it. And this procedure for how to make your own comics by Greg in Lunch Money, his chunky comics, is exactly the way I produce what I call mini comics. So let's get started. Let me see. All right. Put that over there. And okay, this is the introduction to creating mini comics. Comic books were not allowed in my house when I was growing up. My mother felt that there were more important things to read, like children's literature, like books like, Treasure Island, or the Just So stories by Rudyard Kipling, the classic children's literature. And comic books were really not allowed in my house for reasons I'll explain in a little bit. But some comics were allowed on special occasions. And one of those was if we were traveling by car, my mom would get me a couple of comic books to read while I was in the car. And I think I actually had this comic book, this very comic book, when we took a car trip back in 1965. And I was also allowed to read collections of comic strips, particularly Charles Schulz's Peanuts comic, Peanuts. And I also was reading BC by Hart. And but anyway, these are the kind of comics I was allowed to read. I was also allowed comics like Hot Stuff, Little Devil. He was one of my favorites, as well as Stumbo the Giant. I used to imagine myself at the dinner table being Stumbo the Giant and eating what was on my plate and imagining that I was a giant eating different things, like broccoli were whole trees. I was eating whole trees, and Brussels sprouts were like whole heads of cabbages in one bite. And the creating comics, like Greg and Mara in Lunch Money, and doing it at school is what I related to the most with reading Lunch Money. Greg and Mara were told not to bring comics to school and not to sell their comics that they were making for themselves at school. And when I was in the 7th grade, comics were not allowed in school either. I met a friend there named George, who was a comics fan. And he started showing me his comics. But the reasons that comics were frowned upon by my mother and by Mrs. Davenport in the story, and by my by my mother in the school was because of a book that was written in 1954 called Seduction of the Innocent. This book was written by an author named, he was a psychologist named Frederick Wortham. And he was concerned about the influence of comic books on young people. And so concerned that he saw a connection which really wasn't there between illiteracy and unwholesome fantasies and criminality and juvenile delinquency, which and that there was some kind of a threat to mental health and the mental health of our society and to children. And this was what my mother was responding to in 1954 when this book came out. That was a year before I was born. Well, back to my friend George in the 7th grade. George was not only interested in collecting comics and reading comics, and he was coming to give me comics, to show me comics in the library at school, in the little cubicles. We had study hall in 7th grade in the library, and they had these little chairs in front of booths with partitions between them, and the librarian couldn't see what we were studying, and we couldn't see each other either. So we would get together and we'd share our comics and everything in there. Well, one day George brought his comics that he had produced, and his first comic was called Mutant Man. And this is the folder with Mutant Man comics in it. And this is the first issue and the first page of Mutant Man comics. And I thought this was amazing, that not only, George wasn't drawing his own Dennis the Menace comics or Stumbo the Giant comics. He was drawing his own characters that he had created. Mutant Man and Hyperboy and other characters. And I thought this was the coolest thing I had ever seen in my life. I hadn't been exposed to any Marvel comics because my mother didn't allow them. But inspired by George bringing Marvel comics to school, I took some of my allowance money into town where I was living. I went to the Rexall drugstore and bought my first Marvel comics. And these comics were The Amazing Spider-Man number 54 and Fantastic Four number 69. These two comics came out the same week that I, after my bowling league on Saturday mornings, I would go to the Rexall drugstore and buy comics. And these were the first two comics that I bought. But more importantly for me was the inspiration George gave me for writing and drawing my own comics. And this is the cover to the first volume of my first comic. It was Radium the Robot was the main character, and he could shrink and grow. He was a robot. He could shrink and grow, and he fought villains like the Claw there at the top, and he could fight tornadoes, and he could fight monsters, and he could stretch, and he could shoot electro beams out of his hands. And you'll notice that this volume has a little red A up there. That this was a report folder for a project I did for class. It was a class assignment, and I got an A on it. I don't remember what it was. It doesn't matter. I used it for my Radium comics. This is the first page of the first issue of Radium comics. And there was George had the idea, and I don't know whether we did this in 7th grade or in 8th grade, but he had the idea of putting a comic strip in the school newspaper. Now, the school newspaper was printed on a ditto machine. And Ditto machine was a cheap way, an inexpensive way to produce multiple copies, limited multiple copies of something like a school newspaper. And it was printed on a machine called a spirit duplicator. And this is it. This isn't the exact one, but this was the kind of machine. It was a hand crank, and you cranked out the copies that was used to produce the comics. Well, I also found out years later that people were producing fanzines on a spirit duplicator, making a limited number of copies in this purple ink for doing their fanzines, or what would later become mini comics. And the process involves penciling on a Ditto master and then pressing down on it when you convey the image or the typing so that it can be reproduced. And there's a video. I'll send a link to a video that was created in the early 60s about how these things work. It's a really interesting video if your teacher wants to take the time, but I'll send a link along for that, so you can see what the process was for creating these fanzines and our school newspaper. Well, this led to the there was a big fanzine movement that happened in the 1960s. Fanzines had first started in the 1930s for science fiction magazines and science fiction authors, but they eventually, when you can reproduce images, the fanzines were created by people, and the writer of Seduction of the Innocent recognized something about fanzines, that fanzines were a constructive and healthy exercise of creative drives. So he wrote a book in 1974, 20 years after Seduction of the Innocent, lauding fanzines and what a good thing they were. I was very glad to hear that, because 2 years earlier, before that book came out, some friends of mine and I put together our first fanzine. And this was our first fanzine. We called it Venture. And we called it Venture Magazine because we thought it was high class. It wasn't like those Ditto things that they were doing. And there was, this was in 1972. And we were actually allowed in high school to sell these at the school. Of course, my friend Frank, who sold them, didn't ask for permission, and nobody noticed or took notice. So we were able to successfully sell these. But what was more important to me than selling these was that now I knew how I could produce my own fanzines and my own work. And this is the cover of the first issue, the only issue of my first fanzine called Mindworks. I wasn't calling them mini comics yet. I wouldn't do that until later. This is Grimly. He was a character I created who was basically me, who is a little spaceman character stranded on a planetoid all by himself. And I produced a number of strips for Venture Magazine and for my fanzine Mindworks about his little adventures. This particular story is he's a little spaceman who's crash landed on this planetoid. He can't fix his spaceship, so he's stuck there. So he's living in this little bubble house, and a meteorite cracks it. And he gets all mad, and he says, well, that's the third time this week that's happened. But according to a class he took in physics, it's impossible for this to happen for another one to happen, to come down in less than a week. Well, then it starts raining meteorites, and sheltering in place there, he's saying, man, I should have taken the final. Well, this led to my ability that now this is my first, what I call my first mini comic. This is based on a true story that happened to me when I was 9 years old on a fishing trip with my father, and it's called The Hero. And I really love making mini comics. And mini comics have certainly gotten very, very popular in the last couple of decades, actually, since with computer printing and putting together books, you can produce very inexpensively your own fanzines and then share them with others. And I find this was the case with Greg and Mara in Lunch Money. So this is your brain. This is your brain creating homemade comics. And if you have any questions at all, I will probably be doing a question and answer period, or maybe we'll do something here at the end of the 2 weeks of the period that you're studying comics and learning how to do mini comics. But anyway, thank you very much for your time, and I hope to see you guys soon, maybe even in person.